Do you struggle with depression? Have you been told by people, even therapists and psychiatrists, that part of this is just sort of the natural way that it is, and this is just sort of how you have to live your life? Today, we're going to break down what depression is all about and some misconceptions that a lot of people have about it. So, to start, we're going to start by talking about antidepressants. A lot of people think that depression is just a chemical imbalance in the brain. Unfortunately, we more recently are finding out that that may not actually be true at all, that those claims are actually not that well substantiated. So, originally, the reason that we took antidepressants was to help balance out that chemical imbalance. But instead, now what they're finding is that they think that antidepressants serve more as a numbing agent. So, it's sort of like taking an Advil for the mind. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes you absolutely need an Advil. The problem is, let's say that you have a bad hip. And so, in order to deal with the pain of that bad hip, you take an Advil. But you don't actually address the root cause of what is causing you pain. And so, then because you can't feel it, what usually ends up happening is that the bad hip gets worse and worse and worse. And because of tolerance, you have to take more and more Advil in order to numb the pain of your hip until eventually it gets to a point where it's just no longer tolerable and the problem has gotten way worse than it was originally. And so I don't think that it is fair to say that we should completely cut out antidepressants. I think that a lot of people need antidepressants in order to move forward in their lives. I think that the way that I like to think about it is that when you have your face in the mud and everything is too heavy and you can't breathe, antidepressants can help get your face out of the mud so that you can actually start to breathe and actually start to move forward in your life. All that I'm saying is that I don't think that it should be the end of the treatment plan. So we're talking about how antidepressants are sort of like Advil and that they don't actually address the root problem. So what is the root problem? To explain that, I first need to explain a concept. So there is a concept in the medical industry called ACEs, and that stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And basically, it is the way that people measure if someone is traumatized or not. Basically, they'll give you a little questionnaire, and it has all of these different kinds of scenarios on it. You check boxes for the scenarios that resonate with you, the kind of things that you have experienced. And if you check enough of those boxes, congratulations, you're traumatized. But wait a minute, I thought that we were talking about depression, not trauma. Well, it turns out that a lot of depression seems to stem from some sort of inciting traumatic event. And the idea of adverse childhood experiences are basically experiences where you feel completely powerless, where all of your power is stripped away and you have no agency in your life. So Freud coined this phrase that depression is anger turned against the self, which when you think about it in this idea of having all of your power stripped away from you, actually kind of makes sense. Because if you are in a situation where you have no power, the emotions are still going to be there because that's what they're for. So for instance, anger is a corrective emotion. The reason that we feel anger is because the anger is telling us, hey, this situation is not right. Something needs to be corrected here. And then it gives us the energy and motivation to correct that situation. But if you're a little kid and you're completely powerless and you can't make any difference, let's say that, your parents are having a big fight and they were constantly screaming at each other and fighting with each other, there's not a whole lot that you can do about that. Even if you run up and cry and say, mom, dad, please stop, they may not stop. They may keep going. And even worse, you may actually get punished for sort of getting caught in the crossfire. And so that anger is still present, even though you weren't able to carry out its purpose. And so what happens is that that channel that your anger is trying to flow through ends up getting blocked off. And where does it have to go? Only one place, at yourself. So then you start getting angry at yourself. And so that anger rages around inside of you, and over time, it starts to shape beliefs that you have about yourself because you have this experience and feeling of powerlessness, and you have this anger. And when those two things combine, you get narratives like, I'm a failure, I'm worthless, I can't do anything right. Sound familiar? Sound kind of like someone who's depressed? Now, it's tricky because it's not always so explicit. You may not think of yourself that negatively explicitly. So sometimes what we do is we try to sort of compensate for the depression. So what I mean by this is that it will become very important to us to achieve a whole lot. We will need to show everyone that we can achieve and that we are good enough, and we will do everything in our power in order to prove that. But it becomes this infinite treadmill where every time that you achieve something, there's something new that you have to achieve. You constantly have to achieve. It's this treadmill that you're destined to fall off of because nothing is ever good enough. Because where it's actually coming from is the anger that you feel toward yourself because you feel so powerless. And so what happens is then you inevitably fall off the treadmill at some point, and then the depression is right there waiting for you, and you start feeling like a failure and all of that awful stuff. So what the heck do we do about it? We have to start looking back and healing those disempowered parts of ourselves. We have to look back into our past and start asking ourselves questions like, when did I first start feeling disempowered? When did I first start feeling depressed? What was going on during those times? And you may be thinking to yourself, what does the past matter? It's already happened. There's nothing that I can do to change the past. It's in the past. And the really interesting thing, here's where it gets nerdy. The really interesting thing is that that may scientifically actually may not be true. And I don't mean that you can literally time travel, but what I do mean is that science has started to find that the experience that people have when they are triggered to some sort of traumatic event, the way that the brain lights up when the trigger happens versus when the actual traumatic event happened, they are actually exactly the same. There is no difference in your brain between the traumatic event itself and the trigger, which explains why awful things happen to, like Vietnam veterans when they have flashbacks, because they are literally being triggered back to some sort of past memory, and it feels like they are actually there. And the same thing is true for people that are not veterans. But the good part about that is that it means that if you actually go back and start exploring the emotions that are present within those triggers, you can actually start to heal the traumatized parts of yourself as if you were there in the present. Imagine what a difference it would have made if, that little kid whose parents were fighting, and it was so hard for him to see and witness and experience, him or her to see and experience and witness. Imagine if somebody had come up to him and said, "Hey, let me work through this with you. Let me protect you. Let me take care of you during that time." Imagine what a huge difference that would have made. You can literally do that for yourself scientifically. And what you're going to do in all likelihood during the course of that process is that you are going to be taking all of the anger that has been directed at yourself for so long, and you're going to be recontextualizing it. You're going to come to an understanding of, oh, I was a little kid. There was literally nothing that I could have done during that time. I had no power, no agency. And now, as an adult, I can redirect that anger to where it actually belongs. I can place the blame where it actually belongs, which oftentimes, just because, it's sort of the way that psychology works, is with our parents, because, they raised us. And so they have a huge impact on us. And no parent is perfect. And it doesn't mean that your parents are bad and wrong. It just means that they're human. And working through that process and accepting that process will help you to heal. Now, keep in mind, I want to set your expectations. This process is hard and it takes time. And honestly, It's not a process that I would recommend going on alone. I would recommend working through this with somebody. Now, unfortunately, it is actually really hard to find good people to work through this kind of stuff with. But to start, just to start, if you want to do a quick check-in on your mental health, just go to ostaracoaching.com and there's a free 2-minute quiz. I'll leave a link in the description. There's a free 2-minute quiz that will just give you some insights into areas that you might want to focus on. And then if you want to go further and sign up for coaching, you can do that on the website as well. And even if we're not a good match, I will do my best to connect you with somebody who I think might be a better match. And finally, if you could do me a huge favor, the goal of Ostara Coaching is to provide mental health resources that don't suck. That's the promise that we make. And I do my absolute best to do that. And in order to do that in the most effective way possible, I need to know what is effective for you and what isn't. So I've included a little survey in the description that you can take to just let me know what impact this had on you, how effective it was for you. And I would really appreciate if you would let me know so that way I can make more helpful content for you in the future. And you can even suggest new content for me to make. Thanks so much, and I'll see you later. Bye.